What's up, everybody? Aaron from OnesReady here, back with some more exclusive content to go along with the Crosstraining episode and podcast that we just put out. Just wanted to talk to you guys for a little bit. We're going to engage a little bit more here on YouTube and get you guys a little bit more information. From this one specifically, it's just going to be me yapping at you, but I got some good feedback about the last episode, and the feedback for me came from a very close friend, and they said, hey, it's awesome that you went through the process. Good job getting the recruiter on, but where were the stories about your cross-training journey and how it is that you got to be a PJ with all of the things that you went through? And they know my entire story. So I sort of thought to myself, yeah, and that is pretty true. Like, I bet there's a lot of people out there that are going through the same things that I went through to try to cross-train, and maybe putting that story out there will help some of you guys and gals out. So, man, we'll just talk about it real quick. You know, I came into the Air Force in 2001, immediately after September 11th, and I knew I wanted to be a PJ right away. So I got a guaranteed contract, got to Indoc, so I went to basic training on January 2nd of 2002. So September 11th happened. I spent October, November, December at home kind of saying my goodbyes and training physically to get into the Air Force. And then I got into the Air Force, and I reported to Indoc shortly thereafter, because back then it was the indoctrination course. I've kind of alluded to it a couple times. It's probably its own story, I guess, but I failed miserably the first time I went to Indoc. It was not even close. I was emotionally immature. I was on a team for a while, so Hell Night sort of extended training day area. Hurt my ankle. I literally was getting off the track to get out of somebody's way, and I just rolled the crap out of my ankle and was unable to continue. So had to get better and then go on to my second team. On the second team, I blew up essentially on the pool deck at about 7 weeks in. So I'm not going to drop any names or say or do anything, but the bottom line is I 100% looked at everybody there and I was like, F this, I quit, I'm done. I do not want to be here anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. This is terrible. It was 100% due to a personality conflict that I let get the better of me, and I shouldn't have, but I did, and it happened. So I definitely knew I wanted to stay in the Air Force. I definitely didn't want to get out of the military, which was an option at the time. But I definitely didn't know what I wanted to do, and I had never even looked at another career field other than pararescue. I was of a single-minded purpose. I was like, I'm going to be a PJ, and that's it. I'm not even going to need to look at anything else. So I had a terrible backup plan. So for everybody out there, listen, failure is always an option. Do yourself a favor and have a backup plan. Have a B and a C and a D, right? We call it our PACE plan in the military. Your primary, your alternate, your contingency, and your emergency plan. Have that stuff lined out. Even if you're positive you're going to make it, sometimes stuff happens. So I had never done that, and I just happened into this job called aerospace physiology. I don't even remember how it is. Somebody talked me in. The retraining people talked me in to go into aerospace physiology. I had never heard of it before. I thought, hey, that's kind of cool. It's a flying job. You can kind of get to cool schools, and it seemed challenging. So I was like, okay, cool, great. I cross-trained into aerospace physiology. I went to tech school and then reported to my first duty assignment, and it was in Washington, D.C. I hear a lot of input. Guys, girls will text and they'll say, hey, listen, I hate my job. I really do not like this job. I got to get out of this job right now. Man, that could not have been further from the truth. That was not my motivation at all to go back to Pararescue and go back to Indoc. I love that job. Being a phys tech was amazing. I got to go to Arctic Survival School. I got to go to jump school. Jump school was the turning point. I mentioned going to Army static line school as a phys tech. It was a huge turning point for me. My friend that I was on Indoc with lived over at Moody Air Force Base, so he was a pararescueman. He worked over at Moody. I was in Georgia. I had driven my own car down, so I had a car at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I called my friend. I was like, hey, man, I can come over and see you. Like, I'll drive down to Valdosta this weekend, and we'll kind of, hang out. And he's like, yeah, come on down. We'd love to have you. So some of the other team guys came over, and we're sitting there playing cards and having a couple drinks, and he looked at me, he was like, well, when are you going to stop BSing and drop that packet to come back? I was like, what do you mean, man? I was like, that's the furthest from my memory right now. The phys tech gig is pretty good, and I like it. He was like, let's stop. You and I both know you do not want to be a phys tech for the rest of your life. You know in the back of your head, you should be on team with me right now, and you should not be a phys tech, even though it's great, even though you love it. And that one hit me pretty hard. I was like, oh, okay. That was a truth maybe I was not ready to hear, or a truth that I was not ready to live yet, because he was right. I had done my best to try to be really good at being a good phys tech, being a good airman, I had just made staff. I hadn't put it on yet, so I was about to be an E5, and I wanted to do those things correctly. But it was just, he was right. Always in the back of my head, jump school was kind of that defining moment for me that, even though I was happy where I was, I'd made amazing friends. I still have friends that I talk to from the phys tech career field. And I love everybody that I was with in Washington, D.C. I don't have a single bad thing to say about that other career field. It was great. That was not the reason why I cross-trained. The reason why I cross-trained is because I was kind of new in my head that I wanted to be a PJ, and it was always going to eat at me if I didn't try again. So I went home. My daughter was 3 weeks old, maybe. So I immediately went TDY for a month right after I had my first child, my daughter. And my partner at the time looked at me and goes, "So you want to go back, don't you?" And again, I was like, holy crap. Like, we did not talk about it. I'd never really mentioned it. It was never one of those things. And, to her credit, she just kind of said, "Hey, listen, if you're going to do it, you got to do it. You got to be all in. And if you decide to go to Indoc, the second that you leave, I'm changing the locks on the doors, and I'll give you a key at graduation. That's the only way that we're going to put through this." So that decision to cross-train, where I was mentally, physically, emotionally, I did a terrible job. I had that feeling of failure from the two teams before. I definitely, the second, we kind of talked about it on the podcast, when you start saying, "Hey, I'm going to go do this thing," and people start judging you and people start passing their judgment whether you're going to succeed or fail, it gets pretty tough. Like, that's a pretty tough thing to do, to put your ego aside enough to be like, "Listen, I failed. How am I not going to fail this time?" Number one. And then number two, you have all of these other layers. When I tried the first time, I was a single dude that literally had no ties to anybody or anything. I was 21 years old. I was a grown man-ish, sort of a grown man. And I didn't have to worry about anything. And now I'm talking about doing this with a newborn and someone else that was in my life. And that was a really hard thing to try to wrap my head around and try to figure out. And it was tough in those first ones. There was a lot of hemming and hawing. I knew I had a lot of work to do physically. I didn't know when I was going to be able to actually go to Indoc. So, the decision to go back was a lot different. It was a lot different than just showing up to a recruiter on, September 12th and saying, "Hey, I want to go do this thing." This was a deliberate move to change a comfy career. I was established to put other people at risk, right? Like, if I failed out, like, I had a family at this point. That was a completely different feeling. Those decisions, I remember they had a lot more weight. They had a lot more gravity than the first time. So, and I definitely felt like it was a big impact on my life, and it was a big impact on, me as a person. And I was taking a big gamble. I kind of referenced it before as one of the only stories I kind of told on the podcast, but I worked for an awesome colonel. She was a full-board colonel. She was awesome. So I won't do my impression of Colonel Charles, because it is funny, and I've done it with her, so she's fine with it. But she did not want me to cross-train, and it wasn't because she didn't think I would make it. It was because she wanted me to continue being a phys tech. She saw potential in me to be a leader in that career field, and she wanted me to weigh the challenges, and especially some of the stuff. She no kidding brought me in. I think I told a little bit about it on the podcast, but she would bring me in every day when she was considering signing off for me to cross-train. She brought me in every single day, and she made me sit down and explain to her, like, different things. Well, what are you going to do when this happens? What are you going to do when this happens? How are you going to handle this? And she did that to me every day, to the point where she asked my partner to come in with my daughter, and we sat down for an hour and a half, and she peppered questions. How are you both going to handle this? What are you guys going to do about this? How are you guys going to handle this? And it was one of those things that it was just like, holy crap. Something that I never had to deal with before. And it was just looking back on it now, I appreciated that so much. Like, what an intrusive leadership example that she set there to show how much she cared about me, is that she could have just signed the packet and been like, "Okay, yeah, go ahead and try this thing." But she wanted to make sure that I had thought all the way through it this time, and that I wasn't going to fail. And that was some of the best leadership that I ever, especially at that young point in my career, that was some of the best leadership that I ever got to see. And I think about those lessons that she taught me way back in the day. Even now, there are some things that she did now that I hope I'm as good of a leader as she was then. So she finally gave the approval. At that time, there was no separate assessment and selection. So there was no cross trainee stuff. It's just you went through that phase 1, that phase 2 process. Well, just phase 1 really. So you just put your packet together, and then the MAGCOM chief was like yay or nay, and you just showed up to Indoc. And that's exactly what I did. So I showed up to Indoc. My first time back was in September. So I showed up down in September. I went through the development course. It used to be this 2-week little dev course thing that they did, and that was it. It was kind of off to the races. Well, it was extremely short-lived. I think 3 or 4 weeks in, we were lifting weights. We were doing a deadlift, and something just twinged in my back. And it was immediately, I took a knee. I remember who I was standing next to when this happened. He turned out to be a good friend of mine. He's still a good friend of mine to this day that works for the New York Air National Guard. So he works out at the 106. But I took a knee and I looked at him and I was like, hey, Mark, this is bad. Like that's not good. And it just absolutely debilitated me. I could not run. I could not swim. The POTUS staff down there was trying to do everything they could. At that time, you had to go over to the hospital and get seen by other care providers. We didn't have our own internal people like in the Aspect War Wing now. And I just could not get over it. And it just turned out to be this thing where I was missing more training events than you're allowed to, because you can't miss that many training events. And it was one of those things where they were like, hey, man, sorry, but we're gonna have to talk about giving you a setback. That absolutely crushed me. It absolutely crushed me. I trained for so long to get back to that second team. So when I was at home getting ready to go to the team, I'd have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. There was this rinky-dink little pool that I would go to 2 or 3 days a week. And then if I wasn't there, I was with the same group of people at 0430 at Andrews Air Force Base every single day, going hard in the paint. And I was lucky enough to have training partners that one day somebody would be like, hey, you're going to come lift with me. Or one day somebody would be like, hey, let's do a CrossFit workout. Or somebody would be like, hey, let's go for a run today. And those guys would switch off with me so that I had fresh training partners every day to train with. But I was waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes my daughter did not sleep. She hardly ever slept as a small baby. So some days I distinctly remember rocking my daughter, trying to get her to go to sleep, looking at my cell phone, and then turning my cell phone alarm off while I had my daughter, because it was time for me to wake up and I didn't want the cell phone alarm to wake her up. So that journey of months and months and months of training, and then to have it taken away literally right away, I remember just being crushed on that phone call. And I had to call home and have one of the first conversations where I'm like, this thing might not work out. Do we even want to take this setback? And that was a terribly hard conversation. And thank goodness we worked through it, and I was able to get my mind right. I went home and rehabbed and was able to go back on that second team. But I knew darn well this was my last chance. Like, this is it. I had to go and I had to do a clean run from start to finish, no matter what, because if I didn't, I wasn't going to get another setback. And at that time, I kind of went into that second team knowing, like, this is it, man. Like, you're not going to go back for a fifth team or a sixth team. You're going to graduate right now, or you're going to have to go on with your life. And this is just going to be a thing that you never got to do. So got to that second team and got through it. I was lucky to meet some lifelong friends on that team as well. Yeah, spoiler alert, I got through that second team, but I did not stop learning lessons about leadership. I did not stop learning lessons about who I was as a cross trainee, who I was as an NCO, because at this time I was a full-fledged E5. So, all of those other challenges too, when to be a leader, when to, I had to be a student as well. That was a really hard thing for me, is that I would have this parade of guys on team come into my room and say, hey, I had a really bad day. I'm thinking about quitting. Meanwhile, I'm like, I'm trying to get to bed, man. Like, you didn't want to have this conversation at 6 o'clock at dinner. You wanted to have it at 9 o'clock when I tried to go to bed every night at 8:30 at Indoc, because you wake up at 04. So it was really, really tough trying to go through all of those things and be a good leader in order to graduate the course myself and then also serve the people that were on the team. That was a really tough thing to get through. So much so that some nights it really did keep me awake at night. And looking back on it now, I think about times that I failed, or maybe if I could have done a better job, maybe we'd be better. We ended up graduating one of the bigger teams that ever graduated. I think we graduated 29. Pretty sad to say that the guys that graduated that team, unfortunately, some of them no longer with us. Some of them are irreparably damaged, physically throughout their for the rest of their lives off that team. So definitely looking back on that second team now, the one that I graduated on, good things and bad things. I'll always remember that feeling of walking out of the schoolhouse when I graduated Indoc, when I graduated that assessment and selection that we call it now, but back in the day it was Indoc. I'll always remember that. Not so much for the sense of accomplishment, because I did feel proud and I did feel like I did something that I should be proud of. But I remember thinking to myself walking out of there, how many more people should feel like this but don't? And that was something that I never really quite got right with. But in the end, you do what you can in the moment. From there, we went to, the rest of the pipeline. And for cross trainees, you're going to be in 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 different worlds. And what I mean is, students that go in straight from basic training and then, immediately go into the pipeline, they have it a little bit easier just because they don't have all of those other adulting things to do. And that's not to take away from everybody. Everybody has their own story that they're working on their own. But what I mean is, at this point, moving, I drove in a U-Haul with 2 small children. So my son was born in the pipeline, and we drove with 2 small children and a dog and all of our worldly belongings cross country from Washington, D.C. to Albuquerque, New Mexico, so that I could get in to the next class. The way that they did it back in the day is that cross trainees, and they still do it today, cross trainees go to their pipeline schools, TDY, from their current location. So from Andrews Air Force Base, I went TDY to dive school, TDY to free fall school. I already had survival and all the other ones done, so I didn't need to go to those. And I essentially reported to Albuquerque to go to Kirtland Air Force Base to go into my paramedic class. So that was the first time. I spent very little time at Kirtland before I actually got into the paramedic course. But all through the pipeline, going on those TDYs and getting into the apprentice course, you're working really, really hard. And I was in 3 different worlds. So, trying to maintain your own relationship. Adult relationships are hard to take care of if you focus on one another, and that's it, period. Right? You start adding into the mix that we're doing high risk, dangerous stuff all the time. We're gone all the time. You're stressed all the time. You're constantly being evaluated. You add that whole layer on top of it, and it is so hard. It was so hard to get through. Add into that mix that I had 2 small children running around the house. My daughter was, I think, 3 years old. My son was like 1 during the time that we were there. It was a lot to deal with. And oh, by the way, you're on team trying to make those. The guys want to go out to dinner. The guys want to go out and have drinks on the weekends when you're allowed to. The guys want to make those team bonds that you're going to have for the rest of your life. That is such a complex issue that people don't really do a good job of handling. And you see it. I saw it when I was an instructor. You try to mentor those guys to tell them, hey, you need to focus a little bit more of your time on that work-life balance. But that's hard to tell a guy that's 100% all into what he's doing. And I definitely fell victim to that more than one time. I look back on it now and like, hey, maybe I didn't need to go out on, this team dinner when I could have stayed home with the kids or something like that. So, it's one of those things where maybe just hearing it from me, maybe you can prioritize a little differently and keep that work-life balance. Man, Kirtland, I was on the worst apprentice course team of all time. We were terrible. You can ask everybody. Worst team of all time. No cops, no Cros, no lefties, no leadership. Worst team of all time. So we didn't have any Cros on the team. There were no lefties, and the team joke was, it was actually our team patch was no cops, no Cros, no lefties. Initially, in the beginning, it was best team ever. That didn't last very long. We had discipline issues pop up. We had a team motto that I always loved. It was we didn't think teamwork was the end all be all. We said F your buddy and see if he quits. And I think I've said that before, but you would just kind of screw around. At one point or another, the team just got to this place where we looked at the instructors and we said, what are you going to do, smoke us? You smoke us every single day. Every single day you just trash us in the mud pit. I had a commander that I actually worked for later in my career as a PJ. He came out during one smoke session. There used to be this mud pit in the back of the old schoolhouse. And in the back of the old schoolhouse, they'd fill up this pit. And we were just getting trashed and it was for good reason. I can't remember what we did, but we deserved it. And he came back and he said, gents, I want you to listen up. I've worked here for 3 years, and I have put maybe 3 teams in this mud pit. I have put your team in this mud pit 4 times. And if that wasn't a description of our team and how bad we were at some stuff, I don't know what was. It was a miracle that we even graduated the 13 guys off that we did. and this isn't to sound cool. This entire video isn't to sound cool or to tell you a story that I think, you need to hear or anything. It's more so to say, I had so many mistakes in leadership. You would not believe how many times that I just look back and shake my head and go, holy cow, like, how did you not learn that lesson the first time? How did you not engage better on this? And we could talk about all those mistakes in leaderships maybe in another one, but, I distinctly remember it was really, really funny that the commandant of the schoolhouse at the time, Chief Master Sergeant Colon Lopez, he came up and I got my assignment. My assignment was to an STS, and it was overseas, so it was a 321st STS. And CeeLo came up to me at graduation. I said, hey, I introduced my spouse. I said, this is, Chief Lopez. And he goes, oh, yeah, nice to meet you. You guys are going to have a great time in Moody. And I was like, oh, no, Chief, I'm going to England. And he was like, oh, yes, you'll have a great time there, too. And it was funny because he knew exactly what we were in store for, how much I was going to be gone. And he sat down later and kind of talked us through that event that night. But that was the thing that I distinctly remember as capping off my pipeline, is just being like, here we go, off to the races. So that's it. And I don't want to make this too long, and I don't want to make it, you listen to me. If you listen this long, like, good on you. Cross training is its own different beast. And if we look back at the things that we talked about just now, you really have to be set up for success in order to do this thing. And you really have to be extremely persistent. You have to be extremely well thought out. You have to use some vision, and you have to start avoiding those obstacles as early as you possibly can. So just going through the process isn't necessarily the entire story. That's just my story for being a cross trainee and some of the stuff that I've failed on. I like focusing on failures more than I like focusing on successes, because I think if you hear somebody else's failure, somebody else's pitfall that you can avoid, I think you'll set yourself up for success a lot more than just by trying to figure it out on your own. So I want to say thanks if you guys have made it to the end of this. I hope it was helpful. If it's not, let me know. Drop a comment in the comment section, and hopefully we'll start to put out kind of more of these little vignettes from each one of the dudes to put it on there. So get out there, train hard today, earn each breath. Have a good one.